By 1952, the nuclear race was underway. The Soviet Union had exploded its first atom bomb, and the United States had replied with a hydrogen device. The world was learning to live with the Cold War. A new era also began in Great Britain as Princess Elizabeth returned from Kenya as Queen, following the death of her father. For France, there were the death throes of the old order as attempts to maintain control over Indochina brought savage fighting. Nevertheless, the country was recovering its self-confidence after the Second World War. That summer, the beaches were packed with holidaymakers, and the tourists were flocking again to the country's leading resorts. Even the British, despite exchange controls, were crossing the Channel in increasing numbers. And the more adventurous ones were driving across France to the sun. Early in the morning of the 5th of August 1952, police were called to a farm near the village of Lure, where shots had been heard and bodies found. The village is north of Digne, deep in the harsh and lonely countryside of Haute-Provence. When the gendarmes reached the farmhouse, Grande Terre, they were confronted with the bodies of an English family which had been camping nearby. They were 61-year-old Sir Jack Drummond, his wife Anne, and their daughter Elizabeth. They had stopped their Hillman station wagon to camp by the edge of the Route Nationale 96. Lady Drummond's body was in nightclothes, lying next to the car, half covered by a traveling rug. The body of her husband was on the other side of the road. He was dressed and wearing gym shoes. The body of their daughter was some way away, on the far side of a railway track near the banks of the River Durance. Anne Drummond had been shot 3 times near the heart. Beside her were a camp bed, an electric lamp, and an English novel. Her husband had also been shot in the chest, but he had another gunshot wound in the hand. Elizabeth had been clubbed to death with a heavy, blunt instrument, apparently while fleeing from her attacker. The nearby farmhouse of Grande Terre was owned by 75-year-old Gaston Dominici. He farmed the fields around the murder site and kept goats with his wife Marie. Their second son, Gustave, and his wife Yvette lived with them and helped to run the small holding. It was Gustave who had discovered the bodies shortly before 5 in the morning and flagged down a passing motorcyclist to go and fetch the local police. A first search of the car identified the victims, and help was called for. The nearest police criminal investigation department to Digne is Nice, but this was understaffed and passed the request to Marseille. Thus, it was not until 5 in the afternoon that Superintendent Edmond Sebeil arrived to take charge. By then, the murder scene had been overrun by sightseers and local journalists. The area had been well trampled and the car ransacked. Elizabeth's body had been examined by the local doctor, Dr. Dragon. Aware that she was some 200 yards from the car where she had been sleeping, he told Sebeil of the surprising fact that her bare feet were clean and had not been cut. The police had found 4 spent cartridges and 2 unused ones near the car. Then part of the stock of a gun was seen in the river near where Elizabeth's body had been found. The rest of the gun was soon retrieved from the river. It was a US Army Rockola carbine, almost certainly a trophy acquired from an American soldier during the liberation of the south of France. The gun was handed around and never tested for fingerprints. Gustave Dominici admitted that he had heard gunshots at about 1 in the morning, but had been frightened to investigate. He had got up at about 5 o'clock and set off to investigate some damage caused to the railway embankment by irrigation the Dominicis had been carrying out the previous day. The path to the landslide took him close to the car, but surprisingly he had not checked whether the occupants were all right. Only when he neared the railway bridge did he see Elizabeth. A little later, he found the bodies of her parents and flagged down the motorcyclist. The bodies had been removed for detailed examination before Sebeil arrived, but Dr. Dragon told him that since rigor mortis had not yet set in, Elizabeth had probably died up to 3 hours after her parents. Other doctors were to claim this could have been caused by her smaller size, and that she could have been killed at the same time. The police had also started questioning local residents and passing motorists to build up a picture of the murdered family and their last movements. Jack Drummond was a distinguished scientist who had taught biochemistry at London University before the Second World War. During the war, he had worked for the Ministry of Food. With his wife, he had written a book, The Englishman's Food, on how to make wartime rations more palatable. He had also developed a nutritious broth, which Londoners were to come to know well during the Blitz. After the war, Drummond was knighted for his work and received an honorary degree for his contribution to science. The family had driven to the south of France, camping on the way to stay with friends near Villefranche, about 80 miles from Digne. The Drummonds had gone to Digne on the 4th of August to see a charlatade, the local version of a bullfight in which the bull is not killed. They had apparently stayed longer than intended and been forced to set up camp at the somewhat lonely spot sandwiched between the main road and the railway line. Gaston Dominici said that he had seen them during the evening as he was bringing in his flocks. This was agreed by his son Gustave, who saw them preparing for bed. Both men mentioned that a motorcyclist had driven up to the farm at about 11 in the evening and called out in a foreign language. When no one replied, he had driven away. Gaston also admitted to having heard gunshots at about 1 in the morning, but assumed that they were fired by poachers. The 4th had been a busy day for the Dominicis, for it was their turn for the arrosage, when they could water their fields. Neighbors had come to celebrate, but the police did not feel it necessary to find out exactly who had been around that evening or to interview them. Nor did they examine a pair of trousers found hanging in the farmyard after the murders. Both Gaston and Gustave denied owning them. Nevertheless, the police inquiry concentrated on the Dominicis, since Sebeil felt that there were too many inconsistencies in the stories they told. It was strange that Elizabeth's was the first body to be found, since it was not on the direct path from the farmhouse to the fields. He was surprised that while Gustave had been too frightened to investigate the gunshots at night, he had not bothered to see if the campers were all right the next morning. Attempts to find who owned the vital US carbine got nowhere, although Sebeil was convinced it was someone local. The detective was an outsider who did not speak the local dialect, and he soon found himself confronted by what seemed a wall of peasant silence. the Dominicis clammed up, giving evasive answers to all queries. Nevertheless, from other sources, the police were swamped with sightings. A lorry driver saw a tall, thick-set man loitering near the Drummonds' car shortly after midnight. About an hour and a half later, 2 other drivers reported seeing figures moving round the campsite. 2 newspapers, the British Sunday Dispatch and the French Samedi Soir, offered rewards totaling 1 million francs. Posters went up, and the police were confident that local greed would soon lead to a breakthrough. But it did not come, and soon there were complaints in the local press that the Dominicis were being victimized because of their left-wing sympathies. The area around Lourdes had been an important stronghold of the communist-led resistance during the war. Gustave Dominici had been a member of one group. The area had seen bitter fighting during the German retreat, and there had been killing of collaborators and rivalry between resistance groups. Arms had been kept after the liberation and used to settle wartime enmities or local feuds. There had been a number of killings. Gaston Dominici was born in 1877. Illegitimate, he was put into care and became a shepherd after only basic schooling. His only time away from the area had been when he did his military service in 1898. Married in 1903, the Dominicis had 4 children by 1909. Despite his poverty-stricken background, Gaston had worked hard as a shepherd and laborer. By 1932, he had been able to buy his own farm at Grande Terre. He was locally reckoned to be one of the more wealthy peasants. Gaston became a patriarchal figure who dominated his family, particularly his son Gustave. The police got their first break when they were tipped off that the Dominici's neighbor, Paul Maillet, owned a gun like the murder weapon. The search found 2 illegal wartime submachine guns. Under pressure, Maillet revealed that Gustave had told him that when he first found Elizabeth, she had been alive. He had panicked and run back to the farmhouse. The little girl had been moaning slightly, and her left arm had moved, but no one called a doctor. She was dead when Gustave returned to the body. Maillet also claimed that Clovis, the Dominici's eldest son, had heard this. Confronted with Maillet's evidence, Gustave denied it for several hours and then admitted it was true. But he still insisted that he had found the girl after 5 in the morning. Since the doctors were convinced that Elizabeth could not have lived for more than an hour with her injuries, the final attack on her must therefore have taken place not much earlier than 4 o'clock, much later than Gustave and Gaston's timing of the gunshots. Gustave was immediately arrested and charged with failing to give aid to a person in peril of death. His trial began on the 13th of November 1952 at the Palais de Justice in Digne. From the outset, the judge made it clear that the only matter being tried was Gustave's culpability for not helping the little girl. No other witnesses were to be called. Although it emerged that Gustave had almost certainly moved the body, there was nothing the police could do to challenge him or his claim that he had kept silent for fear of being suspected of murder. While crowds waited outside, the court deliberated for 50 minutes and deferred its verdict for a week. Gustave was then sentenced to 2 months in prison. The police were convinced that Gustave had lied, but at the beginning of 1953, they seemed no nearer solving the murder. Criticism in the press grew, but Superintendent Sebeil remained convinced that sooner or later tensions within the Dominici family would bring new information. Then, in March 1953, Gustave's nephew, 17-year-old Roger Perrin, let slip that Lady Drummond and her daughter had visited the farm on the night of the murder to get water. Knowing that Perrin's mother and Gaston did not get on, and that the boy was a notorious liar, Sebeil kept this new information secret. But it did seem to solve one question, which had troubled him: why Elizabeth had not tried to run for help to the farm when attacked. It was only just down the road from the murder site, but possibly she had known where her attacker came from. Some 6 months later, an alert detective checking witness statements noticed that one of them, a traveling salesman, had reported that when he passed the campsite at 7 in the morning, Lady Drummond's body had been lying alongside the car. Yet when the police arrived, her body was at right angles to it. Shown photographs, the witness confirmed that her body must have been moved. On the 12th of October, Sebeil brought the Dominicis in for questioning again. Gustave in particular was interrogated for some 30 hours. He was confronted with Paul Maillet's evidence again, plus the new revelation that Lady Drummond's body had been moved and Roger Perrin's statement. Gradually he broke down, admitting that he had moved the body, but only in order to check if Lady Drummond had been dead. Then on the afternoon of the 13th, Gustave collapsed and revealed that his father had confessed to killing the family after a quarrel with Sir Jack Drummond. Gustave had confided in Clovis, who swiftly confirmed his story that the old man had admitted to the murders. Gaston was defiant, accusing his sons of cowardice and denying everything. But after more than 20 hours of questioning, he too gave in, confessing that he had gone out in the evening with the Rockola carbine to shoot vermin. He had spied on Anne Drummond getting undressed and approached her. Her husband had intervened angrily. They had grappled, and the gun had gone off, injuring Sir Jack on the hand. Gaston had then killed him with 2 shots, and then disposed of Anne Drummond with a single shot. Her daughter had run off, and he had chased her and clubbed her to death with the butt of the gun. This had broken with the impact. Sebeil was not impressed, since many details, such as the number of shots and the timing of the deaths, were wrong. He was sure that the attack had been much more premeditated, and that Gaston was shielding his family. Nevertheless, he set up a reconstruction of the crime. As they were reenacting the chasing of the girl, Gaston took off towards the railway bridge and tried to throw himself off. The examining magistrate was convinced that this was a sure sign of guilt, and Gaston Dominici was taken away to be charged with the murders. Gaston Dominici was brought to trial in Digne on the 17th of November 1954, in the same courthouse that his son had been tried in 2 years before. While in custody, Gaston had withdrawn his confession, and without this, hard evidence against him remained elusive, as press and public crowded into the little courtroom. The police could not even prove that he owned the rifle or that he had fired it. Every time they had interviewed the family, their stories had changed. The presiding judge, Marcel Bousquet, had 2 colleagues and 7 jurors selected from the local population. Maître Émile Pollack led the defense, opposed by Maître Ozin for the prosecution. Under French law, the presiding judge plays an active part in the preliminary interrogation of the accused. So the trial began with detailed questioning of Gaston Dominici, in which he insisted again that his confession had been forced out of him. He went back to his original story, that he had got up at 4 a.m. and taken his goats to pasture. He only heard about the murders when he returned later in the morning. Sebeil must have been aware that the prosecution case rested largely on the insistence of Clovis Dominici that the old man had admitted to the killings. Most spectators soon realized that there were many unanswered questions which the police investigation had failed to follow up. After showing the court how she had been bludgeoned to death, Dr. Dragon asked how Elizabeth's bare feet could have remained clean and uncut despite her desperate flight over stony ground. Dragon was convinced that Elizabeth must have died 2 or 3 hours after her parents, but prosecution experts claimed that the child's body could have developed rigor mortis much more slowly. Maître Pollack pointed out that the police had not followed up the sightings by witnesses of more than one person near the campsite during the night, nor could they account for the discrepancies in Gaston's confession. He suggested that Clovis Dominici, Roger Perrin, and Paul Maillet were out to settle old family feuds. Members of the family continually changed their statements. In the absence of hard evidence, it became apparent that Gaston Dominici's fate would largely depend on whether the jury believed Clovis Dominici's insistence that his father had admitted to the murders. Finally, on the 28th of November, the waiting began, as the 7-man jury withdrew to consider its verdict. As was customary in French courts, the 3 judges went with them and were entitled to vote. Within 2 hours, Gaston Dominici was led back into court. He was found guilty and sentenced to die by the guillotine. Almost as soon as Dominici was led from the court, protests about the verdict and the way the trial had been conducted erupted. After a series of appeals, Dominici's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1957. Part of the reason for this was a new confession from him, which seemed to implicate both Roger Perrin and Gustave Dominici in the murders. The police launched further inquiries, but the network of lies and evasions again proved too great. In 1960, at the age of 83, Gaston Dominici was freed with a presidential pardon. He died 5 years later. The Drummonds were buried in the small town of Forcalquier, but few of the people who attended the funeral or the subsequent trial felt that the truth had emerged. There were too many unresolved questions, and the killing of the Drummonds remains one of the most mysterious crimes of post-war history. Why had the police failed to investigate the witness claims that more than one person had been seen lurking near the Drummonds' car? Why had they not found out who else had been at Grande Terre on the evening of the murder? Why had they not followed up the inconsistencies in Gaston Dominici's confession? If Gaston Dominici had really committed the murders at the time the Drummonds were getting ready for bed, why had Gustave Dominici lied about hearing shots fired at 1 o'clock? How was it that Elizabeth Drummond's feet had not been dirty or cut? What was the motive, since nothing substantial seemed to have been stolen? The questions go on and on. Many felt that although Gaston might have been involved, he probably did not carry out the murders alone. The truth had been successfully buried amid the lies, evasions, and feuds of a peasant family.